Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to the session. This session is India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. Where did their growth trajectories diverge? This session is based on Dr. Ishrat's book, Development Pathways. And we have a very distinguished panel here with us. I'm Hadia Majid. I'm the chair of the economics department here at LUMS. And I'll begin with an introduction of all of our panelists. We have Dr. Ishrat Husain here, who started his career as a member of Civil Service of Pakistan and then spent over 2 decades at the World Bank from 1979 to 1999, where he had many key positions. He became the bank's chief economist for Africa, director poverty and social department, country director for Central Asian republics, and he completed 2 terms as governor of Pakistan, governor of State Bank of Pakistan. I wish he were governor of Pakistan. And these terms were from 1999 to 2005. He has also been as chair of various commissions and other boards, including the National Commission for Government Reforms, Economic Advisory Council, Monetary and Fiscal Coordination Board, and Pay and Pension Commissions. During 2008 to 2016, he was dean at IBA, and he is now Professor Emeritus. In 2016-17, he was appointed as Public Policy Fellow at Woodrow Wilson Center at Washington, D.C. And between 2018 and 2021, he served as advisor to the Prime Minister on institutional reforms with the status of the Federal Minister. He is author of 24 books, prominent being Governing the Ungovernable and The Economy of an Elitist State, which was published by Oxford University Press, 35 chapters in edited books, 25 refereed journal articles, and 100 conference papers. He also has the highest civilian award of Nishan-e-Imtiaz by the President of Pakistan. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ishrat. Next, we have Dr. Sadiq Ahmed, who is a development economist and co-founder of the Policy Research Institute of Bangladesh, which was established in 2009. Since 2010, he has served as a technical expert to the Bangladesh Planning Commission and has functioned as technical team leader for most national development strategies produced by the Planning Commission between 2010 and 2023. These include the 6th, 7th, and 8th 5-year plans, the Perspective Plan 2041 and the Bangladesh Delta Plan 2100, as well as the Bangladesh National Social Security Strategy. He was appointed independent director of the Bangladesh Bank Board from 2010 to 2016, and in 2023 he was elected as expert advisor to the Bangladesh Bank Monetary Policy Board. He previously spent 1981 to 2009 at the World Bank, and he served as country director for Pakistan and Afghanistan and chief economist for the South Asia region. He has lectured extensively on major development topics at a number of institutions, including the US State Department to the Bangladesh Defense College. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sadiq. Joining us online is Dr. Rakesh Mohan, who is President Emeritus and Distinguished Fellow at Center for Social and Economic Progress. He was a Senior Fellow in the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, Yale University, and was also Professor in the practice of International Economics and Finance at the School of Management at Yale University in 2010 to 12. He has served as Distinguished Consulting Professor at Stanford in 2009 and also been a Distinguished Fellow with Brookings India. He has worked closely with Indian economic reform process from the late 1980s, and he was Executive Director at the Board of International Monetary Fund, Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Secretary Economic Affairs, and Chief Economic Advisor of the Indian Ministry of Finance. In October 2021, he was appointed to the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, and he was also chairman of government committees that produced influential reports on infrastructure after the great financial crisis, and has been working on regulations and capital flows since our various crises. He has authored 3 books on urban economics, and his most recent book is an edited volume called India Transformed, 25 Years of Economic Reforms. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rakesh. And we also have with us Dr. Ijaz Nabi, who is the country director for IGC Pakistan. He is professor of economics here at LUMS, and he was also member of Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He's been on the Chief Minister Punjab's Advisory Council and the Monetary Policy Committee of the State Bank of Pakistan. He was economic advisor to the Chief Minister of Punjab. In October 2009, he was appointed Pakistan Country Director in IGC. And he's also part of the research consortium at London School of Economics and Oxford University. Dr. Nabi returned to Pakistan in 2008 after 22 years at the World Bank in Washington, where he worked on Mexico, Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, Korea, Laos, and Myanmar. In 2002 to 2008, he was Manager Economic Policy for South Asia region at the World Bank, and he has published extensively on economic growth, investment and finance, industrialization, trade, labor, and other markets in the developing countries. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nabi. So we have a very distinguished panel here, lots of expertise on the region, and I'm going to start off with requesting each one of our panelists to give us some insights based on the book, Development Pathways. And it would be fantastic if we could focus on critical successes, pain points that we can think about, and really give us how we can have a growth trajectory which is sustainable, that all of the countries can learn from each other and really work towards improving the welfare of the people in these three countries and the region. So we start with Dr. Ishrat.
Can you hear me? Yeah. First of all, let me thank Ijaz, Hadia, and Ali Chima for providing me this opportunity to talk about the book which we have just published and which has been launched, first of all, in Dhaka and Chittagong, of all the places. It was my misfortune that I missed the 8th of December at Delhi, where it was to be launched, because I didn't get my visa on time. And so it's a pleasure to be here at LUMS, because I see many distinguished scholars and the young, students, which I always enjoy talking to. I would like to make a context before I go into the specific critical success factors and the pain points and the risks for the future. First is that some of you were not even born, and because economic history is not taught in our universities and colleges, we are so much focused on the short term that we forget that between 1950 to 1990, Pakistan was one of the top 10 developing countries in the world. 40 years record, 6% growth rate, while India was growing at 3% during that same period. The poverty had declined much rapidly in Pakistan as compared to India. Bangladesh was struggling in 1970s because of the political situation with the assassination of Bandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the martial law and military dictatorship, so it was not paying sufficient attention to economy. So Pakistan was really a star at that particular time. And then it has now become a laggard since 1990. So there's a distinct period between the pre-1990 and 1990 to 2015, which this book covers. And therefore, there are success factors in Pakistan's first success period and India and Bangladesh's second success period, where they have really taken off. So what I have done is try to find the common lessons we can learn from all these three episodes. The first of all is the form of the government and the regime, whether it is democratic, authoritarian, military dictatorship, hybrid, is totally unrelated to the pathway to development. You have stories of having in Bangladesh military governments which didn't perform, but the democratic governments did perform. You have stories in Pakistan where the military governments have done well and the political governments haven't done well. So there is no single lesson we can learn from the type of the regime. What comes out very clearly that it is the continuity, consistency, and predictability of economic policies which really matters, irrespective of what the regime is. So that's the first lesson which comes out quite clearly. The second one is that there is now a political consensus in the three countries about the content of the economic policies. The economic policy choices today and economic management are not driven by ideological predilections. Socialist, capitalist, communist, hybrid, mixed, because you have got all kind of systems which have prevailed in these three countries. And it is driven by pragmatism. And when the circumstances change, the economic policies also change. And the biggest example of that is India, which was practicing for 40 years the socialist model of the commanding heights of the economy and dismantled the license Raj in 1990 when situation changed, and now India has really taken off. So that is the second lesson which we, as circumstances change, the economic policies also change and adapt themselves. The third one is the reliance on external assistance is totally undesirable. The countries which rely on domestic savings and use their savings for the investment have done extremely well. Both India and Bangladesh were in the same league, 15% investment ratios, very low domestic savings, but today both of them have reached 30%, and they are growing by 6 to 7% consistently, while Pakistan has been relying on external assistance, borrowed money, and look where we are. So that particular lesson we should keep in mind. The fourth one is that state binary, market binary, which used to dominate the entire conversation among development economists, is totally outdated. What we need is a strong, effective, and capable government with well-functioning comparative markets, and they perform the roles for which they are suited. The government has no business in doing the business, while the comparative markets have to be regulated in order to avoid collusion and rent seeking. And the state has to provide macroeconomic stabilization, infrastructure, and basic public goods and services. The Bangladesh lesson, as very courageous lessons for the two countries. They have not used their civil society organizations and NGOs to the extent that Bangladesh has used. Microcredit by Professor Yunus, BRACs, primary schools and health facilities, the population planning, all that has been carried out by the NGOs, and they have played a very role. So my submission to you is that it is now a partnership between state, market, and civil society which will actually elevate you to the next layer of development. My fifth lesson is that participation in international trade, technology transfers, capital flows, and migration do benefit the domestic economy very significantly, and they are no longer considered anathema. And export promotion with efficient import substitution, and I emphasize the word import substitution in context of efficient import substitution. They are the policies which will actually benefit the country for sustained growth. My emphasis is not on growth per se, but my emphasis on inclusive, sustained growth. And for that, there are three factors which come out from this study. It is investment in human capital, it is female empowerment, and financial inclusion. If you have all three of these factors, then you are assured that you will have both sustained and inclusive growth. And Bangladesh is a very good example, where 38% is the female labor force participation rates, and the social indicators are completely out of whack with the rest of the South Asia. They are, because the collateral benefits, and Hadia, you have done a lot of work on gender, the collateral benefits of family planning, of nutrition, of education for the children, for the health care done by educated and employed female are enormous, and these are not measured as far as GDP is concerned. So this is what lesson is, that only social protection is not important, but you have to provide the opportunities to the poor families in order to advance to the next stage. The seventh is the devolution, decentralization, and delegation to local governments makes the accessibility to the public services very, very easy, because you have accountability for your elected representatives, while the MPAs and MNAs disappear right after the elections. And finally, India's example is the digitalization really promotes both efficiency and transparency and citizen access. The entire social protection program, especially the employment guaranteed schemes of India, suffered a lot of leakages and corruption. But since they have been digitalized, there are no leakages at all. So this is the lesson of digitalization. What are the pain points and risks? Because of the time, I'll go by bullet points. I will not have elaborate, but I'll come back if there are questions. One is climate change, environmental degradation, and pollution. And we all know about it, so we don't have to repeat what the risks of these are, and the three countries, in my view, are not prepared so far in order to face these risks. Number two, I'm sorry to say that while poverty has declined, inequalities, both regional, gender, and income, have increased. And what worries me is India, which is going on two tracks. One is the south and west, where the per capita incomes are quite high, and one is the Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Orissa, Chhattisgarh, where the per capita incomes are only a half or one-third of the country, of the states in the west. And the number of billionaires is now going up, and according to one estimate, 50% of the national income goes to the top 20% in the income bracket, while the rest of the 50% of the poor get only 20% of the income. So that is something which we have to worry about. The third one is the informal sector employment. All three countries have grown at different paces, but it is not the formal employment which has increased. It is the informal sector, and it is hovering around 75 to 80% in all the three countries, which is something worrisome. As you know, the growth theory of, shows that from lower productivity sectors, if you reallocate resources to the high productivity, growth takes place. What is happening here? You're going from low productivity agriculture to low productivity informal sector. So that is something which you have to worry about. The fourth one is the challenge of the job creation for the youth. India produces 12 million new entrants to the labor force. The entire IT industry, which is doing exports of $150 billion, employs between 4 to 5 million young people. So there's a huge demand for jobs in these countries. The fifth is female empowerment, especially in India and Pakistan. And it is to do with safety, transport, access to finance, social barriers, and worker welfare, which the governments have not paid much attention. The sixth one is the inter-regional trade. We used to be a unified market till 1947, and East Asia was a heterogeneous group of countries. They have now 55% inter-regional trade, and our inter-regional trade has come down to 5%. So that is a driver of growth which is not happening. The seventh is the challenge of urbanization. You have urban sprawl. You go from Lahore to Pindi on GT Road, you find all kind of housing societies coming up which are not planned, which have no utilities, and which are going to become shanty towns very soon. And finally is my pet subject that I'm sorry to say that all three countries suffer from poor governance and very weak institutions. And no country can really take off unless you have strong institutions and good governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ishrat. That really lays the groundwork for us. Dr. Sadiq, you have deep knowledge of not just Bangladesh, but also of Pakistan. It would be great to hear your comments and insights as well.
Thank you so much. Salam to all. Let me first thank Ijaz, CDPR, and LUMS for inviting me. I'm back to Pakistan after 12 years, so it's like homecoming. I'll broadly speak about three topics. One is the development strategy of South Asia, as illustrated Dr. Ishrat's book, and as he explained. A second one would be to talk about the two questions that Ijaz posed for me, specifically about Bangladesh, why it did well, and what are the lessons for Pakistan. And the third question is the issues of South Asia development moving forward, in addition to what Dr. Ishrat already exemplified. Let me first say that the book that I read the book before I came over here, that Dr. Ishrat and co-authors have produced. I think it's very well researched, it's very well argued, and it's in highlighting the long-term development experience of the three large South Asian countries. The analysis of development performance in each of these countries, the main policy conclusions, downside risks are very well identified, I think. And I have no dispute with any of them. My hearty congratulations to you and team. If you recall, we were both in Washington at that time. I wrote a book on South Asia called in 2006, explaining South Asia's development success, the role of good policies.
I've quoted this in my book. Yeah.
Yes, you quoted extensively. The point I'm raising this is because while I argued there that the main reason why South Asia has done so well is on the basis of policies, it also raised a controversy. One of my colleagues and very dear friend, Dr. Shanta Devarajan, he said that no, South Asia's performance is a paradox. Why? Because of poor governance. And I think this is where I really appreciate the research you have done independently after 2006 and 2020, 15 years, basically saying yes, policies matter, and this is what it is. Just waiting for governance and all that, it's important, very important long term. But at least for you can't have to wait for everything to happen at the same time. So I'm very pleased with that. And I think by now I would say it's almost a stylized, development strategy model that has emerged from South Asia's experience, which I think is worth repeating. That in the literature, which is that prudent, a private sector-led growth supported by prudent macroeconomic management, especially sound fiscal policies, reliance on world trade, especially export-oriented production, supported by low average trade protection, low cost of doing business, underpinned by a streamlined and business-friendly environment, and a competitive private sector-led financial sector are all essential elements of a growth-oriented development strategy. I think these are almost like stylized facts of development that has emerged. And public sector role is to basically intervene where there is the market failure, where there is...
You don't need this.
Okay, sorry. So basically, I think that is an important, I would say, message for the development literature and for students who can then look at different countries' experience to say what has happened. Turning to Bangladesh, if I can have the slide on slide one, I have, because it's very difficult to talk about the entire economy, 50 years experience in words, so I have it in numbers. And this is where I make the development performance comparison Pakistan and Bangladesh. I took the 50 years, 72 to 2020, which is when I have the data. And if you look at the numbers, it tells you a story which is very, very clear. If you start with Let me explain to you the main factors. The first result that you see is there over the 50 years, measured by almost all indicators, Bangladesh on average has outperformed Pakistan. But interesting point that Dr. Ishrat also mentioned, between 72 and 1990, Pakistan used to do a lot better. I remember the growth rate was close to 6% at that time. And then 1990 to now, it has 2020, but it's beyond also. Bangladesh caught up and accelerated progress, and while Pakistan growth slackened. Why? That's an important question. There are several reasons for this better longer-term performance for Bangladesh and weaker performance for Pakistan. And a primary factor, Dr. Ishrat talked a lot about it, is the emphasis placed by Bangladesh on human development and gender empowerment. This is something that even India is lagging on gender empowerment. Partnership with NGOs, as Dr. Ishrat has very rightly pointed out, credit programs for women were particularly two very noteworthy features of the Bangladesh development experience. It is also important to note, and this is something not very well appreciated, that Bangladesh spent less than India on human development in terms of share of GDP, and almost the same as Pakistan. So it's not they are not spending more money. The main differences in the development, human development outcomes are in terms of why Bangladesh has done better is because of service delivery, unit cost, and social attitudes, and not just public spend. I think this is a very important factor. You can spend all the money, but without a change in social attitude, without a change in unit cost of delivery, which is the partnership that Dr. Ishrat mentioned, the return may not be as large. I think this is a very fundamental difference. A second factor is also very important, again Dr. Ishrat mentioned, is the focus on capital formation. And just look at the savings and investment rate out there, and it will tell you very clearly. You can't develop at 6% with 14% GDP investment rate, period. There's absolutely no basis. Historically, there's no country which has done it. So if you spend 14% of your resources as a share of GDP and expect 6% growth, you won't have it.
We're very efficient at using our capital.
Huge difference. And here also India, of course, has done even better, but the stagnation investment and saving rates in Pakistan is a major, major development handicap, in addition to the social sector. The third factor, I would say, and which is in some sense the crux of the Pakistan development problem, and a positive factor for Bangladesh development strategy is macroeconomic stability. Until now, and in the last 2-3 years, Bangladesh is also facing major problems. Bangladesh, on average, maintained low fiscal deficits and current account deficit, and pursued prudent monetary policies that helped Bangladesh contain inflation single digits after the turmoil years of 72-80. And Pakistan faced continuous macroeconomic difficulties over a long period of time due to large BOP and fiscal deficit. If you look at the number in 1972, look at the debt to GDP ratios, mind-boggling for Pakistan. And in fact, it's now come down. Why? Because of the renegotiation of debt and all this stuff. But that handicap has been very heavy. Bangladesh placed strong emphasis on export-led growth, another very important factor. I think Pakistan did the same, but Bangladesh outperformed. And the remarkable performance of RMG, ready-made garment, is the backbone of this success. Now, it is interesting to note that it's truly amazing that the RMG revolution happened in Bangladesh, not in Pakistan. Pakistan is a cotton-producing country. Yeah. It has a huge advantage. So I think there's something that one has to look at. And if you want, I would think that these are the 4 fundamental factors why the difference of performance that has happened between Pakistan and Bangladesh. Ijaz also asked me to talk about, could the structural problems facing Pakistan today be predicted in the 1990s? And my short answer is yes. And I'll tell you why. When I joined the Pakistan program of the World Bank in 1992 as lead economist, one of my earliest research I did was to examine the macroeconomic sustainability of Pakistan's growth performance. And I have brought it here just to show. This is it. This is Pakistan, explaining Pakistan's high growth performance past year. Can it be sustained? This is the title of the book. And the answer was no, it can't be sustained. For obvious reasons. Because of fundamental problems of macroeconomic stability, problems with exports, problems with fiscal problems, you name it. And a lot of research, analysis was done and findings were shared with the government. I wish there was a bit more progress. So I think, yes, it was clear that this program was not sustainable and it didn't work out. In terms of the issues moving forward South Asia, Dr. Ishrat has very nicely summarized some of the critical issues, but I think he missed out on one or two that I would like to talk about. One is the tax policy management. I think it's a disaster in South Asia, other than maybe India is doing better now, but the tax to GDP ratio in India has grown to 16 to 70%, which is good. It was a lot worse, and this is one of the fundamental reasons why India's fiscal deficit has become much more manageable. In Bangladesh and India and Pakistan, it's very problematic. 9% of GDP in Pakistan, 9 to 10. Bangladesh is even weaker, 7 to 8% of GDP. I do not think there is many countries which can grow or do better or human development with this kind of tax to GDP ratio. And this is a fundamental problem that South Asia has. Even India's social spending needs to be a lot more if it wants to have inclusive growth. And as a result, even 70 to 80% GDP is lower than most upper middle income countries and of course high income countries. So I think a challenge for South Asia is how can this tax performance be improved. And here I think maybe Bangladesh and Pakistan can learn a bit from South India's experience. How did they move from 10 to 12% to 18%? There is a lesson that one can grow from there. Related to that, the growing income inequality. Dr. Ishrat very rightly pointed out what are the fundamental reasons, lack of inclusive growth, etc. But I think he missed out on one point, which is that if you look at the development research, we see that the income inequality is much lower in Western Europe compared to, say, even USA or even Japan. What is the reason? I think the answer to that question is the whole issue of redistributive fiscal policy. I think in South Asia, redistributive fiscal policy does not exist, partly because of the taxes, also because of the attitude and the government's, in social spending in Japan, in France is 27% of GDP. It's mind-boggling. So I think there is another reason, another area of research we need to do. How can one go and introduce, the redistributive fiscal policy? On this question about political stability and regime and all that, needs a lot more research. But my hypothesis would be that on balance, democratic institutions with this stable political government and political governance would like to do better. And part of some evidence of this is the South Asia, if you can put table 2. And you look at this this again, long-term development performance in three large countries. I think by and large, except for gender equality and maybe a bit on human capital, India has done better. And India's outlook is also better. If you look at all the global indexes that are out there. And it is because of continuity of policy, also political governance is what you call it. There is a lot more competition. Dr. Mohan, Rakesh will talk about it. But my sense is that the India's institutions and political stability has been relatively better than either Pakistan or Bangladesh. I'd like to stop here.
Very good.
Thank you, Dr.
Send me the tables.
Yeah.
And your point about redistributive policies is really well taken. I think it's really important for us to be looking at tax regimes. I'll now invite Dr. Rakesh for his insights, given the Indian experience.
Should I move from here?
I think we're good.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be invited to this conference, to this particular session. And of course, I regret very much that I was not able to come in person. Just by way of starting, I was particularly disappointed because family has amazing number of connections with Lahore in particular, where you are. My brother was born there in 1945. My own grandparents lived and served there before independence. And both pairs of grandparents of my wife lived and served there. And my daughter's roommate in US college was also from Lahore, and she's still there. So I wish I was there. I hope that there will be a next time. So Ishrat has done really a great service to the subcontinent in weaving together a narrative of the development process in each of the three countries. I'm not aware if there's been any other similar book in recent times. So, and one of the reasons for that is that given the frictions that exist in our subcontinent and that has been talked about in terms of trade, it's very difficult for anyone to really have a good knowledge of the conditions and progress and policies and issues in each country. So Ijaz, I think thank you very much, and Hadia for bringing us all together. It is, of course, Ishrat's book is really a Herculean task to compile a narration of all the three countries' development process and certainly ours. Of course, in Indian development process, there are many tomes which you can go through. But one does need to remember all the time about India that there is a Rashomon effect. The different observers have different views of what has happened despite examination of the same data. And the joke about economists, of course, is not only do they argue about the future, but they also keep arguing what happened in the past. Also about India, there's the old Joan Robinson aphorism. In India, if one thing is true, so is the opposite always. So it's always a little risky to talk about the Indian development process and what policies did what. So let's start at the beginning. Ishrat, you say at the beginning almost that the subcontinent had a well-functioning network of railways, ports, highways, irrigation, etc. I don't think that that's really true, except perhaps for the railways. Only a few ports, huge lack of roads, and both because my grandfather and my father were in the public works department as civil engineers. As a child, I went through all kinds of roads, and particularly in UP, and basically they didn't exist in the till a much later time. So I think that I think all the three countries, and of course there were one country at that time, have to first say, look, we started from a very, very low base. And on power, my favorite statistic is that the total installed capacity in India at the time of independence was 1,762 megawatts. And that's like a big power station now, or two big power stations. So we were actually, the whole subcontinent was really literally left in darkness. And as I said, this sort of thing applies to all the three countries. So what each country has done since then has really done largely by ourselves. Now, what other interesting thing I find is that given that common background, there's remarkable similarity of pathways followed by each country, though to varying extents and of course at different times, despite lack of communication. We all did planned protectionist import substitution policy to begin with for a period of time. There was in all our countries resistance to change as the world changed and particularly the rest of Asia changed. We all indulged in different kinds of nationalization, whether it was banks or other industries, and roughly similar times, though not exactly, of course. We controlled trade, had all kinds, had complex administrations to control trade. So what that shows is, and also much of the terminology used in each of the countries has been very similar. So obviously the drawing of lines and borders demarcating our countries, lack of trade and communication hasn't separated our minds. We seem to work very similarly, although perhaps in different timelines. So I think that this is important to keep in mind, that somehow we do walk sort of locked in step, although of course at different times. The other, again, to begin with, in terms of the first 15 years, both in Pakistan and India, and of course at that time Bangladesh was part of Pakistan, that the policies followed in the first 15 years, let us say from late 40s, early 50s to mid 60s, really followed the dominant accepted development thinking of the time, which had resulted from colonialism and lack of development and so on, which Ishrat has documented very well, I think, in his earlier chapters. There was common export pessimism in developing countries everywhere, in Latin America, everywhere. And there was consensus on the need for infant industry protection. And what is very interesting is that what we used to say that, look, how can we compete with all these developed countries, advanced economies, in terms of technology and so on in industry, and that's why we have to have protection. And what is ironic now is that the advanced economies now in the West, through the new industrial policies, are saying exactly the same thing vis-a-vis China, the perceived superior competitiveness. How can we compete with these guys? So we have to do some protection, we have to have industrial policies, etc. So what my point is that we had a common 15 years or so. Of course, Pakistan did much better in that period. And there was a general view that the state had to invest itself at that time. And that was really a consequence of lack of capital in the private sector and perhaps capacity as well. Remember that savings rate in all our countries in the 50s until the early 60s was actually all right through the 60s was 10% or less, or maybe +2. In India, the savings rate was less than 10%, right 50s and 60s. It finally went up to around a little over 10% in 1971. So my point is that a lot of the self-flagellation we do to ourselves in the subcontinent is not justified, given the kind of savings rates that we had, and therefore the kind of and the infrastructure, what I talked about, the power sector, and so on. I'm not trying to be an apologist for things, but the point is that in the first 15 years, perhaps we got things right. In the case of India, this is separate from Pakistan, that our lost decades were from the mid-60s to 1.5 decades, mid-60s to the early 1980s, whereas in Pakistan, Ishrat has documented, is post the 1990s. In India, I think it's important to record that the dark period, in some sense, of economic policy, 1965 to 1980, was really characterized first by lots of issues, political issues, exogenous issues and exogenous shocks, huge drought in the late 60s, China War in 1962, which had impact continuing, the Bangladesh War in 1971, the oil price shock in 1973, our own departure from democracy from 1975 to 77. So all those, there were big shocks. But nonetheless, what we did was really slow down the economy. While the rest of the world was at that time, particularly Asia, going ahead, we tightened all our regulations. We put in small-scale industry reservations. So everything in which East Asia has become competitive, we had reserved for small scale. Therefore, we could not be competitive. And that impact of that remains till today, which is also a lesson that if you have wrong economic policies, it's not just the period of those policies that's a problem, but also it remains for a very long time. I won't go through all the different kind of controls that we imposed on ourselves from the late 60s. It wasn't there as much before the late 1960s and continued right to the 70s. It only in the 80s, which again Ishrat has documented, that new thinking sort of started seeping in, right from Indira Gandhi in the early 80s, somewhat accelerated by Rajiv Gandhi, but it was still somewhat tentative. But as a consequence, we did get about 5.5% annual growth of GDP. The savings rate became up to just under 20% in the 80s. The I-core, by the way, was less than 4. So that's quite something. The big thing, of course, bang came in 1991, partly because of crisis, partly I would also say global events in terms of the Soviet Union being broken up, and in some sense the victory of the West. So there was an overall move, and here I think what is very interesting to me is that all three of us, I've yet to hear Ijaz, but all three of us so far agree on some of the very main points on broad approach to economic policy. There is a move to more open economy, greater resilience of markets, increased participation in the private sector, relatively smaller role for the government, more welcoming to foreign investment, etc. I won't go through the whole list. So that has a huge impact. Now it's 30 years since started these reforms. And I think the important point for India, different from both Bangladesh and Pakistan, has been a continuity of governance despite changes in governments and political parties at the top. I myself served all governments from 1986 to 2009, and then again 2012 to 15, and now again, not directly but indirectly as a member of the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister. So that just shows a kind of continuity that we've been lucky to have, and I think that has done a great deal for us. Just to go to the future, I have a general agreement with all the points that that both Ishrat and Sadiq made. That one, we really need to increase the tax GDP ratio. We are at around 16, 17%, and of course, Bangladesh and Pakistan at 10% or less. In our case, by the way, the tax GDP ratio has been remained rock solid for at least 15 years, if not more. And that's very difficult to understand given the kind of growth rate that we've had in incomes and also the huge increase in very, very well-off people. So that's a bit of a puzzle. I don't quite understand it, despite the fact that we've had really comprehensive tax reforms for 30 years. And in some sense, a good part of our tax structure is really globally competitive. So I don't quite understand why the tax GDP ratio has been low. Second, that again has been mentioned by Sadiq as well as Ishrat, that where we've failed is in human development. And that has to be the thrust of our next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And this is a very big issue because we will not get, none of our countries will get the demographic dividend unless we can find employment opportunities for all the youth coming out. And that, of course, depends both on the demand as well as supply, that we have to really improve both the quality and quantity of our education. Health, again, Sadiq mentioned this, that we have not done very well. You know, the proportion of the so-called stunted children is over 30%, and wasted children under 20, just around 25%. Now, they can't become productive members of the population of the labor force unless there's a huge emphasis on education and health. Second, again, something that each of us is saying is the issue of decentralization and localized government. Here, it is in some sense very, very strange that I don't know enough about Pakistan and Bangladesh, but certainly about India, that we have retained what I would call the colonial administrative system through the civil services, when in fact, we can't get ahead further unless we really decentralize with local government, both in rural and urban areas. And remember, India will have something like 60 to 65 million plus cities in the next few years. So you need a huge amount of urban investment. That will only happen if there's much more local self-government. There is, I'll look at the last sort of issue, I think all of us agree on that, is being open to the global economy. The issue now is the changes that are taking place in the global economy in terms of certain kind of economic fragmentation, lack of agreement on policies, even though all four of us, or at least three of us, is what yet Ijaz, have a great degree of agreement, but that is going to be an issue. And I have already mentioned the new industrial policies of advanced economies. How are we going to react to that? And I hope that we don't copy them, because that only be to our disadvantage. The economy must remain open to ensure access to global markets. Another issue I would say is, and this is something on which Bangladesh has done very well, which is manufactured goods exports. But I presume the problem that perhaps Sadiq can comment on this, the problem I'm foreseeing there is that it's still too concentrated in one sector. How well can they start diversifying and going up the value chain? In our case, it's a real puzzle that the 91 reforms, of which I was among the progenitors, luckily, that a big focus was on industry. One thing that is not done as well as we would have thought is Indian manufacturing competitiveness. Our share it's ironic that the share of manufacturing in GDP now is not that different from agriculture. And that's a real puzzle, and some of us are working on it. But I think that's a huge issue, and I would imagine it's an issue for Pakistan as well. And finally, that we do, again, as Sadiq said, and I think Ishrat was saying, that we must have universal provision of public goods for both the welfare of people as well as for economic growth. And we must find ways and means of incentivizing labor augmenting investment. And I think that there's a lot of the discussion and argument today is somewhat premature, I think, for our countries, talking about automation, robots, AI, etc. What I always say is that, look, if you include the whole of East Asia, China plus India, and East Asia, South Asia, China plus the subcontinent plus ASEAN, you're 4 billion people. And if we grow even at 5% a year collectively, there's a huge demand for the next 20 years of goods. And therefore, the argument that many people are making is that the time for labor-intensive manufacturing is gone, I think is just untrue. And South Asia is the region with the best, in some sense, demography in the world, and some degree of competence, although not as much as we ought to have, to take advantage of this. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much for letting me have 2 minutes extra.
Thank you. Shall I start?
Didi, I'd like to just set it up a little bit.
Sure.
So thank you, Dr. Rakesh. And I think the point about demographic dividends is so important, particularly given Dr. Sadiq's table. Pakistan has the highest fertility rate. Our education and health systems are in shambles. So we are hit with a double whammy of low productivity, high population rates, and that's really undercutting our progress. One thing that I noticed in the table that you'd put up was foreign reserves. So India's foreign reserves were at 500 plus.
600 now.
596.
They're now 600 above.
Yes,
Now 600.
and we were at 17, I think.
Yeah.
So Dr. Nabi, since we have you here, please, it would be great for you to give us some insights on the fiscal and balance of payment crises that Pakistan just finds itself in again and again.
Thank you, Hadia. But first, I just want to follow up on a request by Rakesh. Rakesh shared with me 2 of his recent publications on the Indian growth experience. One is Moving India to a New Growth Trajectory, written in June 2019. And the other is a 3rd generation strategy for accelerated growth and development in India. One is written for Brookings India, and the other for CSEP. We've made several copies of each of these publications, and I'll leave them here for people to take them. Rakesh, thank you very much for sharing. Aapko de do.
Give one set to each of us.
I thought I could charge you a little price.
This is for me. $10 each, yes.
हमारे reserves थोड़े से बढ़ जाएंगे.
LUMS can.
Rakesh, are you still with us?
Oh, we have.
Yeah, I'm right here.
No,
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ijaz.
So we're
in any case, I didn't assume you'll give hard copies because it can be accessed virtually from our website. And of course, I've given you the link.
Yes.
I've given you the soft copy.
Yes, we will share the link, but there's nothing like the hard copy. So. Okay. Rakesh said that this is this needed to be done. Some publication which compares the 3 countries. I'm very happy to note Mr. Razak Dawoodi is here, and he would be happy to note LUMS actually did a study of comparing South Asian countries. This study was done I think it was put out in 2010. And it does a lot of this. It looks at the 3 countries, their overall growth performance, their sectoral growth performance, and actually looks at competitiveness in a fair degree of detail. And this is also available for those who want copies of these. But Ishrat's book is, of course, a tour de force. There's a lot more than just the sectoral comparisons that we've done here. Ishrat gets into the politics, the political economy of things, the individual country stories. So there's a hell of a lot more work gone into Ishrat's book than this. But I just wanted to make sure that there's understanding that LUMS has been contributing in this area for a while. All three speakers have gone deeply into their respective countries and given us a good understanding of how things work out. I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to take two examples, two arguments that link Pakistan's macro problems with micro issues, so that I can get at the political economy dimension of the problem. Because we heard from Stefan Derkon this morning that at the end of the day, it's the political economy, which is different in different countries, you get different outcomes. So with that in mind, let me start off with, I have some slides that I want to share with you. Next one. Okay, so I've drawn on three pieces of work that are ongoing. One is a book that Anjum and I are co-authoring forever and ever. Hopefully it'll get completed soon. It's called Living Within Means. It's all about Pakistan's fiscal problems, expenditure and revenue side. We should be done soon. The other are two papers that were completed recently, working with the Paris School of Economics. One is
Ijaz, can the screen be shared with me? It was a little early and then it's gone off, so I'm only seeing you.
Okay.
And not the screen.
Okay.
Screen को कर दें.
Can you see it?
No. No, earlier you were showing that instead of the picture of the people, you should just have the screen, which you had a few minutes earlier. No, well, you better go ahead, Ijaz, don't waste time.
Okay.
Error message आ रहा है आपका.
Okay, error.
Okay.
Anyway, you better go ahead, Ijaz,
Yeah,
sorry.
Okay, so
Doesn't matter.
So
We'll share it with you later.
So the two other papers are Pakistan's external debt, trends, outcomes, and sustainability, and are overseas remittances a source of Dutch disease in Pakistan. So that's the body of work that I'm drawing on to make some of these comments. Please. So, you know, the current account, the fiscal, everybody says manage the fiscal well and you'll be okay. And we saw that, and I'm not giving you the picture for that the fiscal and the current account deficit track actually quite nicely in all three countries. But Pakistan's case is a bit special. And I'm now comparing Pakistan with India. Pakistan is the green line, India is the blue line. And you will see in the first graph that India's fiscal deficit is considerably higher than Pakistan's in many years. Now you'll see in the other graph that Pakistan's current account deficit turns out to be much higher than India's in most years. So Pakistan's fiscal has a much more severe impact on our current account. And if our reserves are low, which have all, if you go to the second or third, yeah, these are the international reserves. And you will see that Pakistan is substantially lower than India in terms of months of imports of reserves. So if you have a fiscal deficit that quickly translates into large current account deficit and you have low reserves, that's a recipe for frequent balance of payments crises. So the question is, why does our fiscal so rapidly get converted into the current account deficit? There's a huge literature on this. There's a lot of empirical evidence on this. But there are two broad reasons why our fiscal very quickly turns into a large current account deficit. One is the way we manage the fiscal deficit. We manage the fiscal, a lot of our fiscal deficit is because of the subsidies that we give. And if the exchange rate depreciates, the subsidies that you give become larger. So we have tended to overvalue the exchange rate for long periods of time. When it becomes a real crisis, we let it go. But for long periods of time, and Nabi has done excellent work in this area, for long periods of time, our exchange rate remains overvalued largely because of our concern about the fiscal. And that prevents the current account deficit from getting corrected. Because if you allowed the exchange rate to do its work, imports would become expensive, exports would become cheaper, and therefore the conversion of the fiscal to the current would be not as severe as we see in Pakistan. So that's one reason. The second reason why it happens is because the cost of financing our fiscal deficit is very high. And the reason why the cost of fiscal deficit financing is high is because our savings rate is half that of India and Bangladesh. You can show that slide. Saving and investment rates, half those of India and Bangladesh. Why do we save so little? Go to the next slide, please. Population growth. When you have a large number of dependents in each household, the marginal propensity to consume from income will be very high. You save very little. And you can see our population growth rate, again, is twice as high as India and Bangladesh. Correspondingly, the savings rate is very low. Correspondingly, we are much more vulnerable to current account problems because of the fiscal deficit. The reasoning, the logic is very clear. Why our political structures, why our political systems, and like Rakesh, I've also had the opportunity of advising all three main political parties. Why this message doesn't get registered is something that, Rakesh, of course, I haven't had the kind of results that you've had in India. Now, to give credit where it's due, I was advisor to the Chief Minister of Punjab when he was, to Mr. Shehbaz Sharif when he was Chief Minister of Punjab. And a friend who's a very good demographer, Zeba Sattar, she showed some numbers on fertility rates, which I shared with him, and he said, look, the number that really moved him was that Punjab had an abortion of 1 million every year, which is among the highest in countries at a level of income. He saw this and he said, we should do something about it. And one of the things that he tried to do was to set up we'd had success with the Skills Development Fund. So the government only funds, doesn't do brick and mortar work. I'm now taking the macro to the micro and the political economy underlying these things. So we set up a Punjab Population Innovation Fund with the objective of highly targeted interventions in order to demonstrate that there is a way still to lower the fertility rate. So this was set up. Go to the next slide, please. This is, I just want to show you the promise and the actual implementation. The fund was set up in 2016-17 with an initial funding of 200 million rupees. The approved budget by the independent board of PPIF was almost 4 billion. The actual ADP approved less than just over half of it, but the actual funds that was released were about 40% of it. So from a promise to actual results, it gets slashed. Why does it get slashed? It gets slashed because all kinds of other priorities come in the way. The priority became getting rid of the Sharifs. Therefore, everything that they did was corrupt, including the Section 42 companies they set up. Yeah. This was a Section 42 company. So for 2 years, there was no budget. Subsequently, every time there's an IMF program, to show that there is money in the coffers, you stop releasing funds, even for those programs which are delivering. So the question is, I mean, I put it to a politician, a senator, a very sensible senator of the PPP. He said, look, all political parties will agree with you that bringing down the fertility rate in order to lower the population growth rate is absolutely critical for us. But none of us will put it in the manifesto. And I said, why? He said, because the way you have structured the NFC award, the higher the population, the larger the award.
Yeah.
We are not going to, we agree with you, we will say whatever you want us to say, but we are not going to implement it. So here is a macro problem. The underlying cause of that macro problem is well understood. What needs to be done is well understood, but the politics of it completely muddies the waters. Now, this is one example I wanted to share with you. The other is on, and so this is political economy as it manifests itself in national politics. I'll give you another example of political economy as it manifests itself in global politics. This is Pakistan's external debt profile. Ratio of debt stock to GNI, it falls during Musharraf's years. This is the Bin Laden effect. Okay, the world's largest opens, and our debt is either restructured, reduced, or more money comes in, more free money comes in. But look at the last curve there, which is trends in exports and debt service. You can see that the share of debt service is rising, and it continues to rise. Now, the reason why, meanwhile, even though in rupee dollar terms our exports are rising, the share of exports to GDP is actually falling. So we are accumulating external debt at a time when our exports are declining and debt servicing is rising, a recipe for difficulties. Next slide, please. Forget this. We did some fancy econometrics to establish that what I'm saying is true. So just accept what I'm saying. Move on. I just wanted to. Now, what happened? Ishrat, this book is fantastic. We should all read it. A little bit date adjustment. I think the problems are macroeconomic problems, although the root of it goes much deeper and is much further back. But I think in the 2000s, it really begins to hit us, because we were accumulating external liabilities, all of it concessionary. We don't have commercial debt. Commercial debt is a much difficult issue to solve. We were accumulating all of these liabilities while our export to GDP ratio was declining. External debt, we had two episodes of large external debt. One was 60s, when we got a lot of concessionary external financing, but a lot of it was grants. It was highly concessionary. The debt that we were getting in the mid-2000s was largely was less concessionary. There were no grants. The second thing that happened, and this is where I want to bring in Sadiq into the discussion, since he was at the other end. International institutions felt obliged to lend to Pakistan. There were all kinds of pressures on international institutions to lend to Pakistan. I was part of the team with Sadiq, looking at the Pakistan program from the other end. There was enormous pressure to lend to Pakistan for being the frontline state on the issues in Afghanistan. The bank, for very good reasons, switched to what they call balance of support lending, budget support lending. They said, look, let's strengthen countries' own systems. Let's not micromanage how they spend the money. Let's have a very broad condition on the results that we expect, and let's just give them money. It was well-intentioned, but in Pakistan, which had turned into a security state by that time, economic governance was collapsing very rapidly, as we all talked about. This was a recipe to spend till kingdom comes. All our deficits were being financed through external borrowing, which was becoming more and more expensive. So here is a case in which the donors were complicit in Pakistan landing in the difficulties that it is in. I'm not shifting the blame entirely to donors. We are very guilty of the problems that we are in. But the political economy shows that there are both global as well as national reasons why we are in the dire straits that we are in. There is a way out of this. Pakistan's problems are not complex. We have worked on countries. In East Asia, the financial crisis was a very complex crisis because the private sector got into trouble. When private sector gets into trouble, the banks get into trouble. Resolving bank financial crises is very difficult, commercial banks. Ours is largely a government crisis. It can be managed when the IMF comes, etc. We behave ourselves, we cut things back. So it is a doable problem. But we've got to give the political space, the time that political parties need in order to complete reform. We cannot change governments every 2 years and expect what is basically not a difficult, complex reform to go through. Thank you.
Dr. Ijaz, would you like to pose a question?
Yeah. Okay, so sorry, Rakesh, this was self-flagellation, as you called it, but it was much needed. So we're going to move on, and you know, I've been in this business of regional trade for a long time. I've spent a better part of my adult life as a professional economist trying to get regional trade going in South Asia. I'm a bit jaded because it hasn't gone very far. If anything, Rakesh is speaking via ether rather than here. So things have not gone as... So it would be fantastic to have a book like this and say, okay, what are the next steps that we need to do to open up trade? Or what are the next steps we need to do on climate change? Somebody showed me a satellite image of Lahore engulfed by fires on the Punjab side, our Punjab side, and we said, oh my God, this looks awful. And then they showed me the full picture, which was the Indian Punjab, fires lit in Indian Punjab, and Lahore was bang in the middle of it. So we will not be able to solve these problems without countries talking to each other. So it would be fantastic for us to write these books, to have these discussions that lead to an actual program of reform, etc. But having said that, it's still important for us to just to learn lessons from each other. I think we need to continue to talk. I think there would be a lot more mileage, Rakesh, and I'd like to get your views on this. If we were to, rather than at the national level, if we were to do it at the more state province level, for example, compare the two Punjabs. There's a lot of similarities, there are a lot of lessons to be learned from each other, and similarly do it for the two Bengals. So if we could go more micro, maybe there'll be a lot more learning to do, especially on institution building, etc., and strengthening local governments. I'd like to get your views on that. And I'd also like you to, as part of this, I'd also like you to expand a little bit on, you know, a lot of people here have read Ashok Modi's book, India is Broken. and some of what he says makes sense, but clearly the larger story of India, and as you yourself said, you can look at India from different angles and come to the Rashomon effect, as you called it. But it'd be nice to get your views on what Ashok says on human development, but also on doing these comparisons at a more at the state and province level.
Thank you, Ijaz. Before I get to your two questions, just one overall comment on the key problem that you highlighted in the earlier part of your comments, and that is to do with how is it that the Indian higher fiscal deficit doesn't result in a higher current account deficit, and why don't we get into greater problems? And I think the key answer there is what you sort of mentioned is really the gross domestic savings rate.
Yeah.
And it's because of gross domestic savings rate being higher, even though the Indian fiscal deficits have been high forever, but almost all the funding for
Came from
the fiscal deficits are domestic funding. And I can tell you on a lighter note that there's constant pressure from foreign investment banks, all kinds of people coming from the West, wanting us to borrow more. There was a lot of pressure on the government of India to do that while I was deputy governor 2002 to 9. And once I had to say that if you agree to increase your foreign commercial borrowing through all these guys, you'll have to carry me out. You'll have to carry my dead body out of the Reserve Bank of India. So we have had a kind of a consensus on this for a long time. Now, there are other implications of this. One, that clearly the CAD, right? We know this is from Econ 101, right? And since all four of us were brought up in the World Bank for a period of time, we were educated on this. That the obvious CAD is a reflection of this domestic savings investment gap.
Yeah.
So I'm afraid any country which has a higher domestic savings investment gap is stuck with high debt, high foreign liabilities, and high CAD.
Yeah.
So one other point I want to raise for all three of the countries, actually, which I've been worried about, I talked about a manufacturing problem, which is that don't we all have an equivalent of a Dutch disease?
Yes.
Basically through our remittances.
Yeah.
The remittances, the proportion of GDP are much higher for both Pakistan and Bangladesh than us, but we make up for that through our service exports.
Yeah.
So for the last 20 years or thereabouts, we have a constant surplus of about 6% of GDP, including remittances and service exports, which means that we can have, quote, a market-determined exchange rate, which is balanced, while running an 8% of GDP merchandise trade deficit, but only, say, 1 or 2% current account deficit.
Right.
And I presume the problem for Bangladesh and Pakistan is worse because it's all remittances. So I'm saying I think these two issues are very connected. And it's a very core, I think, of the problems of the countries like yourselves, which have a very big gap between savings and investment.
Right.
Okay, now to your questions. One on the sort of micro comparison of states. It's a good idea, but the problem in some sense is that you need to know a lot about the sort of detail of each of the two states. And so if that can be done, certainly, but there's an issue, say, between Bengal and Bangladesh, which is that one is a country, and so you can talk about national policies and so on, whereas one is a state, which, without making any comment on what they do, but obviously they are constrained by what the central government does.
Right.
In the case of Punjab, Indian Punjab and Pakistani Punjab, maybe there might be more to it in terms of comparison, particularly because they do have a lot of similar characteristics, including all the environmental pollution caused by the burning of waste. So yes, I think that would be useful. Sorry, just give me the second question. Just give me a hint and I'll get
the second question was, Ashok Modi's characterization.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Talking about Ashok Modi is like a red flag to me. And especially because he's a long, as Time Magazine would say, long-time friend. Really very, very close friend since the so almost 40 years. So there's no question that and I've said this many times myself, if I may say so, before he wrote his book, and it's in the one of the papers that I've sent you, which is to say that our biggest sort of fault in policy has been neglect of health, education, and nutrition.
Yes.
I think there's no question of that. However, the point, you need to look at a little bit of the macro also, particularly in the 50s and early 60s. As I pointed out, if your gross domestic savings is around 10%, and in the case of India, we, because of our size, we could, even if countries wanted to, we couldn't get the kind of external aid in terms of grants as other smaller countries could. Korea, as you know, South Korea in the 1960s had almost a negligible sort of savings rate. And the whole investment program was financed by grants from the US, obviously for geopolitical reasons. And in the 70s, it was commercial. It was commercial loans and equity. So my point is that achieving a 3.5%, or actually almost between 3.5-4% growth rate in 1950 to 65, with 10 to 12% savings rate was no mean task, no mean achievement. Second, this I don't know enough. And I've written the same thing myself. I don't quite understand why Mr. Nehru and the government of India in general didn't pay enough attention to education and health. But what I do wonder is, given the kind of literacy rates that we had in our whole subcontinent, was it possible to do the kind of education program at the would you have found the teachers? There was no infrastructure. As I said, there was no power. There was no electricity. There's certainly no village roads at all. It's 75 years later that we now have almost all villages connected by an all-weather road. But even still, it's not 100%. It's very near 100% now. So my point is that for education and health, you need to have much more diversified infrastructure, which we did not have. I'm not giving an excuse. I've just been trying to understand why this happened.
Questions?
Second, I would say that, so I agree with Ashok on that point. I don't agree with him at all on his characterization of the first 15 years. I agree with him on the second 15 years. But again, I think he's not given enough credit to the Indian state, Indian government, in the last 30 years or so, how it has functioned, despite all the changes in government.
Thanks, Rakesh. This book it's called India's Broken, and written by Ashok Modi, who was also at the World Bank and the IMF, and now a professor of practice at Princeton. So,
India is the title. India is broken and it can't be fixed.
Please.
On this point, Ashoka is also a colleague and friend, so I sent my India chapter to him, and he said, Ishrat, you are right. This is a standard narrative of India's economic turnaround, but that's not what I'm focusing on. I'm focusing on the enrollment ratios, the female participation rate, the stunting of the growth, and all the human indicators, which you also point out in your work, and I also point out that this is a pain point for India. So I don't see why people, he has very, I say, seductive title of his book, but otherwise what he says is not far from what you and I are saying about India's future.
But Ishrat, we say it in 20 pages. He does in 400.
That's
right.
different.
There's a big difference.
A little bit different. No, I think the evidence is clear that India needs a lot more to do on gender and on social equality. I think India's problems are even more complicated because of this caste system, because of this religious divide and all that stuff. So I think it is a challenge, and social inclusion, inclusive growth, both are issues in India.
Do another round.
So there is no debate, and whether you call it broken or not, I do not know. That may be a bit too much. But I think the attention being paid, because Ajit Chibar,
Yes.
they also wrote a book along a similar theme, that they, what is called lack of equality or opportunities and all that, both in economic and social, are becoming major issues.
Yeah.
And
it's selling well. With that title of the book,
Yeah.
it is selling very well,
Just
actually.
selling very well. And is getting a project syndicate to write.
Another book.
But one.
I just, if I may just interject here, just one couple of points. One, that yes, the human capital point is well accepted by many people, but the book goes much beyond that.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's not just that. He just says that we are not bothered about it.
Yeah.
Almost all governments have been non-functioning.
Correct.
He does not acknowledge the average. I mean, it's no joke to have average growth of 6.5% for 30 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
I may be critical that it should be 7.5,
Yeah,
8. But the point is, you have to acknowledge it,
Yeah.
and to say that it can't be fixed. I mean, it's just unacceptable.
Right.
And there's no way it can be appreciated for writing that. Human capital, everyone agrees.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we need to have one quick round before we open up for questions. And this is going to be a very quick one. We have climate change
Yes.
upon us. All three countries will need to adapt
Right.
in a major way,
Right.
which means that we will have to revisit our lots and lots of production functions.
True.
And make amendments, make changes in those production functions.
Right.
How ready are we to tackle this problem at the national level? Let me start with you, Sadiq.
I think Bangladesh is not ready. Absolutely not ready. I think there's a lot more attention given to advocacy, and damage is done to us by Western countries. The per capita pollution is very low and all that stuff. But I think they have not internalized all the lessons of experience of changing their own policies. So whether you talk about fossil fuel consumption, subsidy on fossil fuel, pricing policies, then technology choices, everything, agriculture, everything. So I think there is a lot of advocacy, awareness, not integration of policies and institutions for local development. So I think there's a huge agenda out there. We have written immensely. We are not ready at all. I don't think there is a dollar solution. I don't think we'll get hundreds of billions of dollars from somewhere. It is not going to come.
Yeah.
And therefore, huge problem.
Yeah.
I think we had a success story of Indus Water Treaty between India and Pakistan. And despite 2 wars, the treaty continued to be effective. With the glacier melting, snow melting actually at a very rapid pace, there is now a need for a new Indus Water Treaty, because Pakistan, being a completely irrigated land dependent on the glaciers, and India being also affected by that, we have to think about the future, because the food, energy, and water security are all linked. And the second area is the pollution, where there's a bilateral between the Punjabs. So we need regional cooperation in that. And Bangladesh has a very different situation. And I must give credit, when I was subdivisional officer, we used to have cyclones, but there were no shelters, there were no early warning system. And to that extent, I visited recently, Bangladesh has done a fantastic job on the disaster management.
Yes.
So it can be done, but we need now a new Indus Water Treaty.
Rakesh.
Yeah, obviously that's in some sense the issue of the century. I'll just make a couple of general comments. One, that one of the things that we are trying to work on is that, in all the COPs and otherwise, the huge numbers being given out in terms of how much is needed and how much external flows are needed. And one of my comments on that has been that when you give me numbers of trillions, first of all, I have no idea what $1 trillion means. It's very difficult to figure out what does it buy, But the point is that if you give such numbers, you say, well, there's no way we can have that kind of money, so people don't do anything. So my point is, in terms of as researchers, I think we need to get a clearer idea of what we need to do in the next 5 years. Rather than 2050, 2070, etc. That just goes beyond my head, at least. So I think that's just a sort of research point, and also implementation in the sense that, look, how much in power do we need to do, how much in water control, and all the rest of it. So that, I think, and that leads to this general issue that to do that, you will need much more internal coordination between ministries, etc. And question is, do we have that kind of mechanism? And two, as both you said, that look, you need inter-border coordination, and for climate change issues, because the climate thing does not observe national borders. So I think that is certainly very important. And third, I think that there can be much more technology transfer between ourselves, in the sense that many solutions will have to be local and cheaper than what international technologies will do. I don't know what they are, but just the way that, say, India can send up a mission to an unmanned mission to the moon with a fraction of the cost of what NASA would do anyone else. Similarly, I would imagine that between ourselves, there must be lots of ways in which we can work both in adaptation and mitigation, if we have much better communication in terms of science and technology and solutions.
Thank you, Rakesh.
Yes, so let's open up for questions from the audience. G. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Javed Yunus, and I'm an economist working on the energy sector and development issues of Pakistan. So my question is to Dr. Ishrat Husain Saab. Obviously, who knows better than him in Pakistan that how our power corridors work or do not work? But before that, I will just have a little comment on what Dr. Ijaz Nabi said. You showed us the graph of terrorism, and obviously we have lots of attention to the terrorism, because whenever even a cracker blasts near Islamabad, everything shakes in this country. But is terrorism a bigger problem than the electricity outages in this country? Like, there are 8 hours of average electricity outage in Karachi, 14, 15 hours in Balochistan. Think about Sindh, and nobody cares. And with the kind of circular debt we have, pension reforms, and then debt servicing, I don't think we can fix our fiscal space or current account deficit or anything like that. But I just, sir, a few months ago, I wrote an article making a comparison between Pakistan and Bangladesh purposefully.
You'll have to ask a question.
Sir,
and soon.
Sir. Pakistan female literacy rate is 25.5 percentage points lower than Bangladesh. 14, Pakistan's labor force participation rate, female, 14.4 percentage point lower than Bangladesh. We need to educate 16.27 million women right now just to come to the rate of Bangladesh, and employ 9.9 million women to just come to the level of the Bangladesh. And there are many things. I can share the article with you. Though my question is to Dr. Ishrat, that, sir, you have written a lot on reforms, especially on civil services reform, local body reforms. And I don't know how much of that has really worked. You did your job the best.
You better ask your question. Even in formulating the question, you're taking 5 minutes.
Sir, why do you think reforms have not really implemented, including the local body system reform that you've been writing out, and civil services reforms?
It has been documented so many times as to what are the constraints. There are constraints of political economy, and there are constraints of discontinuity of the economic policies. 2001 to 2007, you had a very good, viable model of local governments, where all the surveys show that people were satisfied with the availability and the delivery of public services. In 2008, they removed all the system, and we have got it even today. So that is a policy discontinuity. Number two, on the civil service reforms, you have a vested interest of the people who are occupying the key positions. They are the decision makers, and they get in collusion with the political leaders, and they oppose all the reforms which would take away their entitlements. So who wants to, hurt themselves? It's very clear that it is the elitist group interest which is driving this whole process where there is a resistance reform.
No, please. Can you please stop? Somebody else.
जी
नहीं, आप कहीं और जाके बात कर लेना ना उनके
बाद में आप मुझसे बात कर लें, चलें.
Thank you. Engineer Sadiq Rahman Rana. My question for Dr. Ishrat, Ijaz, Nabi sir, with reference to the way forward for economy. Whether academia, industry, government helix on self-sustainable public-private partnership with two-point agenda is the answer. Number one, narrowing the gap between emerging technology, in particular biotechnology, and transformation of agriculture and industry accordingly. Secondly, positioning the youth and academia in line with the industrialization horizon analysis. As per our horizon analysis, since last 10 years, maize production have doubled, textile halved. So maize-based bioproducts are going to overtake textile sector. In industrialization, it didn't happen. I suggest LUMS and CDPR to consider creating awareness and positioning our youth and academia in line with the industrialization horizon.
Thank you. Good suggestion.
जी इधर.
कुलसूम कह रही है भाई, कुलसूम को बड़ी देर से हाथ उठाया हुआ है.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you. Really fascinating discussion in this panel. My question is actually for Dr. Sadiq Ahmed. Bangladesh succeeded in improving human capital indicators. Dr. Ishrat Husain pointed out that it was actually a partnership among civil society, private sector, public sector. Could you tell us a little bit, in order to succeed at those, you usually have to work at the local level.
Right.
So how did that work, given the political economy, which wasn't that much different to what it is here or in India? What happened in Bangladesh to make it work, to improve those indicators? Thank you.
Good question. You see, the civil society NGO really filled the vacuum in the local level. They did not work with local level government. Local governments are very weak in Bangladesh. They do not have much capacity, they don't have any resources, they're not very well organized. Even the political local governments have emerged only very more recently. So there was a huge gap, and education and health care delivery is heavily centralized in Bangladesh in terms of the public delivery. So what the partnership that worked is the NGOs found a vacuum. Government did not create roadblocks. That was their main role. Yeah. It was not that they said that, okay, you do it. No, they just let them do it because it was serving their interests.
Right.
They were getting the results. Government took the credit. Delivery was coming, and funding was from foreign governments, basically FCDOs and others, USAID, others. In fact, the whole population program was run by USAID in the 70s, and it was all done through the local governments, the delivery service, the NGOs and the civil society, because government didn't mind. I think the small country, distance, density, common language, common culture and all that made it much more easier, frankly speaking, which is more difficult. Say here, you are either a Punjabi or a Sindhi or a Balochi or a Pathan. They are very different. In Bangladesh, everybody is Bengali. So I think that made it so much easier to deliver, the low transport costs, and then the ability of the people to organize themselves. And what these NGOs did, which was very good, is not only they went with their infrastructure, they also built up capacity of what they call community-based organizations. So basically, they will pick up, because there was no local governments to come and intervene because they didn't exist.
Yeah.
Just to add, the cost effectiveness of the NGOs, the government would spend 4 takas, and the same thing will be accomplished by the NGO by 1 taka, because they supervise and they manage. Otherwise, you have contractors and getting money, and it was a weak government. He quite rightly said. So the cost effectiveness is one solution.
We'll just take one last question because we're way over time. There's a very good World Bank study on the NGO movement in Bangladesh by Hassan Zaman. To look out for it. Excellent.
Thanks, everyone. Great session and wonderful interaction, sir. Dr. Ishrat talked about climate change, and we three countries are not prepared for it. And Dr. Ijaz Nabi talked about 2 Punjabs covered in fire on map. Primary reason for this high air quality index in Delhi and Lahore of around 400, world number 1 and world number 2, is crop burning or biomass burning in Punjab. I was part of a UNIDO-sponsored research in Nust University. In that study, we calculated the agri residue of 17 districts of Punjab, and it was 9.5 million tons per year, having a potential of 1,000 megawatt. So we talked about electricity deficiency, let alone from Pakistan, Punjab, we can generate 1,000 megawatt from 17 districts. So my question is from Dr. Ishrat, that why government has failed to put up waste to energy power plants, and this hold good for India. If we have 1,000 megawatt potential, they have around 500 megawatt potential, and similarly for Bangladesh. Thank you.
We have 41,000 megawatt installed capacity. We are paying 60% of the electricity dues the consumers are paying for capacity payment.
Right.
That we have surplus electricity and where demand is much lower. So increasing different types of modes of electricity generation at this point is not. The distribution companies are doing a lousy job. Unless we open it up to the competition, to the private sector, I don't think our energy problems are going to be fixed.
Great. With that, we wrap up. Thank you very much to all of the panelists. Thank you, Dr. Rakesh, and thank you to the audience. This has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rakesh.
Thank you very much to everyone for inviting me.
Rakesh, next time we'll have you over physically.
Yeah, we should.
We should.
We will use.
You'll have to build tunnels like the Hamas.
No. We will build transponders. Thank you.